Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon, everybody. First up, my affiliation. I've just confused you, just making sure you're all awake. So I'm the director of something called the UK Energy Research Centre these days. And my home university is University of Sussex, but I think that's less important than what I'm hopefully going to say, which will be, I hope, important. So what I thought I'd do is really look at climate policy specifically because the whole of sustainability is quite a lot to cram into 20 minutes, let alone climate policy itself. I'm going to do three things in my 20 minutes. One is to talk a bit about the climate change issue. I'm going to assume most of you know why this is something that's a huge challenge for us globally and on a national level. But I'll talk a bit about the conventional economic solutions, which are still important, by the way. I'm not dismissing them. But I'm also going to argue, as it says in number 2, why perhaps a more complex approach may be needed as well. And then finally some policy implications. So 3 parts. So I've got a couple of slides on the challenge. I mean, clearly one of the big challenges is that, as science has revealed for quite a few decades now, the emission of greenhouse gases globally is rising over time, and that is giving rise to changes in our climate, which has already started to lead to some impacts, and many models and analyses show that those impacts are going to grow over time. So you can see here the growth in emissions globally, ending in 2014. The other reason I put this slide in was really to show that the source of that growth in emissions has started to shift over time, and that now that most of the growth in emissions is now coming from outside the OECD countries. And not within the OECD countries. Actually, OECD emissions are starting to level off already, but emissions from countries like China, India, and so on are continuing to rise rather rapidly. Secondly, what do we do about that? And just to make a point which I'll come back to a bit later on, which is that we don't have unlimited time to solve the problem of climate change, or at least to mitigate its worst effects. And that's what this diagram is really designed to show. It's from some work done by my centre over the last couple of years and published just recently. It really shows the relationship between a temperature objective, which is on the vertical scale, so 2 degrees, 2.5, 3 and 3.5 degrees. 2 is the one that most governments have signed up to as a result of the UN process. And then the circles show the year of peaking of emissions, so 2015, 2020, and so on. They're different colours because they show the rate at which emissions would have to fall in order to stay within that temperature increase. So if you wanted 2 degrees and you wanted to peak at 2025, then you're talking about reducing emissions at 4% per year globally from that point in time. The earlier you peak, the less precipitously you have to cut emissions on a global basis. That's because the emissions over time matter, not the emissions at any given point in time. So this is an issue where, not only do you have to think about the complexity, but actually you've got limited time to try and make changes in the economies which give rise to emissions. And then thirdly, just to link it back to the Paris negotiations, which are going to be in this city in a few weeks' time. This is from the sister institution to the OECD, the IEA again, showing really the difference between the pledges that many countries have now made under the UN Framework Convention system to cut their emissions. So those are the blue lines. It's the bottom one I'm really interested in, the dotted lines, which are about emissions. And the green is where the IEA says the globe needs to be in terms of reducing emissions in line with that 2-degree objective. So I think there are 2 headlines from that. One is that many countries are doing more than anybody previously hoped they would. So we're actually heading in a better direction, if you believe the pledges, than we thought we were. The second is that there's still a gap between that and where we need to be. So hence the need for more action and a good agreement at Paris. So on to policy responses. This hopefully I won't need to go through in any detail for many of you. But there are 2 sort of market failures which often get mentioned in the academic literature when it comes to climate change. The first one is the obvious one, which is that in the end, CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions are an externality, and so therefore you internalise the cost and you either tax emissions or you put in place emissions trading or another way of pricing that externality. The second is also important because of the role of new technology, whether it's new to the world or new to particular markets, in solving the problem. And that is that actually, although the private sector will invest in research, in order to tackle some of these issues, they will tend to underinvest, as they do in innovation in general, in R&D in general. So therefore, there's a public policy justification for government spending on research and development. And that's often where the story ends. And so a lot of prescriptions will focus on those two failures and ways to fix those two failures. And that, again, is important. But what I'm going to say is that there are probably other things you also need to do. So I'm just going to go through 4 reasons why I think you need to do more than just fixing these 2 market failures. I'm going to come back to this graph, so I won't stay on it right now. I'll come back to it. And the reasons behind these 4 areas that I'm going to go through come from a number of other issues which are seen as impediments to change, which come out of more complexity evolutionary economic thinking. So the first of them is that actually the systems we're looking at, and you can probably say the same for other parts of the economy as well, but energy systems are incredibly path dependent. So even if you wanted to change an energy system today, you have to think about not only changing the technologies and the infrastructures, which are generally set up for the use of fossil fuels, but actually many of the institutions that govern markets, many of the behaviours and many of the policies are also set up to support that fossil fuel-based economy, which has served many countries very well for many, many years. It provides people access to relatively low-cost and convenient energy in many cases, although that's not always been the case. So this lock-in, this path dependency is really important to take into account. So it takes time to change these systems. The second, which we've started to discuss a bit in the earlier sessions, is the limits to rational decision-making, and that's not just for individuals but for firms, because in the end a lot of climate change policies rely on firms and individuals making different choices to the ones they've made in the past. So the importance also of social networks, which we spoke a lot about in the earlier sessions, and what I've called here structure versus agency. To what extent can an individual firm or a household actually really make the right decisions, or are those choices constrained by the structures of energy systems, their access to capital, what technologies are available, and so on. And then other types of networks are often mentioned as well, that we need to build new capacities and skills. For example, to upgrade houses so they're very energy efficient. It's different to the skills that in many countries you've had in the past. Or actually running electricity networks as smarter networks rather than as one-way, what you might call dumb networks, to put the opposite of smart on the table. So those are just a few of the rationales for these 4 areas I'm going to mention. So just to go through those, if I can persuade the slides to work. The first one is not an argument against carbon pricing, but certainly efforts in the EU, which has gone perhaps furthest than many other regions of the world, to try and price carbon and to try and internalise this externality, have not been hugely successful. In a sense of setting up an emissions trading scheme, that has been an incredible achievement to have one at all. But because of various factors, including politics and bargaining and also recessions, the price of carbon coming out of that system has not been particularly high and has not been particularly reliable. But it's a market, so you wouldn't expect it necessarily to be reliable. But certainly it isn't doing the job that the architects originally envisaged, which is to really drive behaviour which invested in new technologies, in lower carbon technologies. All it's doing is probably at the margins having some operational impact on decisions of people like power generators, but it's certainly not leading in itself to investment. So one of the challenges is, do we try and work harder to make carbon markets work? Well, in theory, of course we should, but in practice we don't have the time, perhaps, so we may have to do other things as well. So that's one of the reasons I think more things are required. I said I'd come back to this diagram. So the second is prices are of course important, but they have limitations. And one of the reasons they have limitations is that for certain consumers, you'd actually have to make carbon prices very, very high in order to have any real material impact on their decisions. And so I've got an example there. One of the reasons I've used this curve is that basically, and it comes from McKinsey, who've made a fair living out of making these curves. And basically what they do is they show all the different ways you could mitigate emissions, which is on the horizontal scale, and then lining up how much they might cost on the vertical scale per tonne of carbon abated. So all of the ones that fall below the line are basically negative cost measures. Energy efficiency is a classic one. On the right-hand side are those measures where you'd have to spend some money to make that carbon saving. So ideally, you set a carbon price and then markets will work and you'll do the cheapest stuff first and then eventually go to the more expensive stuff. The problem is that some of the things on the cheaper side of the graph, such as, and I've only highlighted one there, which is falling off the bottom of the slide there, which is plug-in hybrid cars, is that actually in practice some decision makers, i.e. motorists, already face an extremely high carbon price and they still don't change their behaviour. There are good reasons for that. So in the UK, an average person buying fuel to put in their car is probably paying about £300 a tonne of CO2 in taxes. It's not called a carbon tax, it's a fuel duty, but it's still a tax. So the implication of that is you'd have to put a much bigger one on in order to change that behaviour. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the alternatives don't exist and the alternative infrastructures don't exist. If they did, then perhaps you wouldn't need quite such a high price. But that's behind my point that although prices are important, and of course UK drivers are probably driving around in cars which are much smaller and more efficient than they would be if our fuel taxes were as low as some other countries, but certainly they're not having the intended effect of switching people over to low-carbon vehicles just yet. I think the other point, and this is another version of the same curve, but only for energy efficiency, is that even for energy efficiency, which many of those measures in homes and businesses will pay back very quickly, in a year, in 3 years, in 4 years, there's a lot of very well-documented literature from economics and other social sciences which shows why, due to bounded rationality and the way decisions get made, that many of these measures only partially get taken up. So again, just because they're below the line doesn't mean that they get taken up automatically and naturally. And I think that's quite a challenge both for an analyst and for a public policy maker, because public policy makers say, well, it's very hard for me to get support for a policy to fix this problem if all you're showing me is that actually these measures pay off automatically without intervention. You need to give me something more in terms of evidence. So perhaps complexity approaches have something to bring to the table there. And just to expand that point slightly further, here is some evidence from outside economics, from other social sciences, which really start to put their finger on what it is that determines people's choices and behaviour. And this, again, is in households. It's from a trial that was done, quite a controlled trial, a large-scale trial of smarter energy networks in the UK. But it basically identified five characteristics of what actually influences behaviours. Some of those will be familiar for those of you who know the economic literature too. So conventions, habits and routines are very important. Capacities, how technologies provide the services you need. But also things like the timing of daily life. There is a limit to the extent to which people can actually shift their energy use around, even if the price differential between using energy at one time of day and another time of day is very, very large. People will be very loath to stop cooking the evening meal at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the evening, even if you can say, well, it'll be a tenth of the cost if only you'd cook your evening meal at 9 o'clock in the evening. People simply won't move those. There's the financial and social resources they have to make those choices, information, the amount of money they've got access to, but also structures. And this is quite challenging because it takes you into policy domains which are nothing to do with energy or climate. They're to do with education, or they're to do with the way our health service works and so on, which basically put in constraints on what people can do. So that's the second one on prices. The third one, just to expand this point on lock-in, this is from Thomas Hughes, a historian who wrote some really good books about the genesis of the electricity industry in many countries, and really making the point that these histories don't only tell you how the technologies and the grids changed and were built, but it actually shows you how the grids were built at the same time as the policies, the institutions, the standards, and other things. So if we're just trying to change the technical component there without paying attention to the way the institutions are tied up with that and the actors, then perhaps we're not looking at the full picture. So we also have to think about the institutions and laws as well as changing the technology. And then there's a number of papers by Greg Unruh from the US who extended this to carbon lock-in rather than lock-in more generally. Obviously, these ideas date back to Brian Arthur at the Santa Fe Institute as well. To say, well, actually, the fossil fuel-based industries, again, they benefit from a lot of economies of scale and returns to scale. So you've got to counteract those if you're really going to shift energy systems and make other types of technology attractive. And finally, this point of time scale is that that's also constrained. So it's not only that we want change, but we're actually trying to get change in a relatively short space of time, as I illustrated earlier on. The fourth one is about innovation. We've already heard a bit about the linear model earlier on this morning, and hopefully this is something which will get picked up in the final session of the day as well. So again, this will be familiar to many of you. The top diagram is the linear model, where we have research that's funded either by the private sector or the public sector, and then eventually technologies move through development and demonstration and get diffused in markets, the so-called linear model. Still rather popular as a heuristic, even though empirically, both in industry and academia, it's been shown that it's not really a very good model that describes reality. The bottom, more complicated diagram probably captures it better, in the sense that there is an innovation system instead, and that all of the stages feed back to each other. In other words, they are coupled together. You get just as much innovation, or perhaps more in some cases, in diffusion than you do in the laboratory. So a really good example of that is the recent dynamism of solar photovoltaics, where the thing that's driven cost reductions isn't a new scientific breakthrough in the laboratory, funded by either a private company or a government. It's actually the scaling up of that market, helped by subsidies in places like Germany, the UK, California, and so on. And that's allowed a lot of process innovation in Chinese factories to bring the cost down. So innovation happens all the way along that scale, that chain. And the importance of actors, networks, and institutions, the public and private sector, are emphasized by that second model. So what flows from that? Well, a couple of points. One is we spend a lot of time, certainly in the energy and climate area, looking at, well, if we're underspending on R&D, shouldn't governments do more? And I think, before we say that, there is, I've got 5 minutes, brilliant. What are they spending already? So this shows you the pattern of government R&D spending across the OECD or IEA member countries going back to the first oil shock in 1974. One thing it shows you is that spending rises and falls with the oil price. That's the black line. So if oil prices fall, interest in energy issues has tended to wane, and therefore R&D spending has waned. But of course, climate change has come up the agenda, leading to the peak towards the end of that graph. The other thing which is important in the context of this discussion is the peak in 2009, which is part of the response by many governments, particularly the US, to the financial crisis of 2008. So a lot of spending made then as part of the reaction to that crisis. But the other thing I think to draw attention to as well is the diversity of funding has actually improved. So historically, a lot of focus on nuclear power, which is the big orange area, and there's still a lot of emphasis on that. But you can see once you go to the right-hand side, a lot of governments spending money on the demand side, energy efficiency, on renewable energy, on smarter networks, and a whole range of other technologies. So it's got a lot more diverse. But again, the debate is often about R&D, research and development. The extra D is for demonstration, which is the point I'll make now. So I think one phenomenon, again, empirically observed, and it's not just an energy phenomenon, is that often if you're taking the conventional economic approach and saying, well, we'll spend some money on R&D so we get more innovations coming out of the development phase, and you spend more money strengthening markets by pricing carbon, then actually what you end up with sometimes is a gap in the middle of those two. And that's this pink bar on this slide called the Valley of Death. This is a slide from one of our agencies in the UK called the Carbon Trust, basically showing that for developers of technology, the red line, you have very high levels of risk in terms of developing that technology for quite a long time until you're getting very close to market, and then the level of risk starts to fall off quite dramatically because you've got a product that probably works. At the same time, the required level of investment, the green line, accelerates very quickly once you start demonstrating technologies at scale. And there's often a crossover between those two when you're spending a lot of money, but the risks are still very high. And often that combination means that the companies left to themselves just simply won't cross that valley of death. So that's a further rationale for government support around that middle stage, not just upstream R&D. Now, because of lack of time, I'm not going to go through my couple of examples, but this one I will just say that carbon capture and storage, which often comes out as a critical technology from many models that look at how to mitigate climate change, is a classic that's got stuck at the moment in the valley of death because governments collectively are not spending enough money on demonstrating that technology. We still don't know whether it will work. I think it will probably work technically, but whether it will work commercially is an open question. But until it gets demonstrated more, we're not going to know the answer to that question. The second example I had, which again I won't spend very long on, is just to give an example of a technology which isn't necessarily in itself low carbon, the smart meter, but it's potentially part of a whole infrastructure upgrade for the energy system where it can unlock a whole set of new energy services that could help consumers to save money and to reduce their emissions, whereas in itself, it might not do that much. So, given I've got a minute left, I will go to my final slide. So what are the implications? And these are just 5 headlines really from the points I've made. So first, I think in theory markets should deliver emissions reductions if we address those 2 market failures I spoke about earlier on. I certainly think carbon pricing is necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient to mitigate emissions, especially on the required timescale. So we should be pricing carbon, we should be working harder to reform the emissions trading scheme in the EU and to link with trading schemes elsewhere in the world. But I don't think we should be waiting for those things to be sorted out. We need to do other things. I think the focus on R&D only misses the point. Low carbon innovation requires a broader approach on demonstration, sometimes on specific instruments like feed-in tariffs to develop markets for new technologies. So we don't need new breakthrough technologies. We actually need to deploy and demonstrate those ones that we have first. So we do need tailored markets and incentives and radical changes maybe to overcome lock-in, development of new infrastructures. But I think that 5th point is really important, and it's an important result from a lot of economic analysis, is that we have to be quite cautious when we're calling for more intervention of this kind, because of course governments can then get captured by special interests and lobbies, and so therefore government and government institutions need to have very strong capacities in how to manage innovation, how to experiment, to accept failure, and actually to change priorities when things aren't working out. So experimentation, learning and evaluation, which are key insights from complexity theory, become really important for this. I'll stop there.